the director.
This meeting is being recorded.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Claudette Graham, and I'm the Director of Education at Wiscoh, West Indian Social Club of Hartford. On behalf of the West Indian Social Club and Wheeler Clinic, I'd like to welcome and thank you for joining us tonight as we collaborate to engage the community in our continued discussion on mental health and wellness. Tonight's topic is youth eating disorder and nutritional awareness. Before we begin, I'd like to set some ground rules. This event is via Zoom only, so please be respectful and mute your phones when you're not speaking. And if you do have a question, we ask that you put it in the chat box or raise your virtual hand and you'll be recognized. The mission of Wheeler Clinic is to provide equitable access to innovative care that improve health, recovery, and growth at all stages in life. Their vision is that all people will have the opportunity to grow, change, and live healthier and productive lives. 72 years ago, the West Indian Social Club was formed as an entity to socialize and engage the community. Today, the mission remains the same. It serves as a gathering place for meetings, educational forums, and social functions. The goal is to unify the community on a cultural, education, and social level. This initiative with Wheeler Clinic is to fulfill that purpose. And so our moderator tonight for this presentation is Dr. Gary Rule. Dr. Gary Rule, MD, MPH, is co-chair of the Jamaica Diaspora Northeast. He is an internal medicine physician and a public health practitioner. He's also the former commissioner of public health for the city of Hartford. Dr. Rule is also an author. His book, Sailing on Broken Pieces, is about his brother who suffered from mental illness. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Brother Rule, who's going to be the moderator for this series with Wheeler Clinic. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Graham, and thank you for joining us today. A big welcome to everyone for joining on this evening. As Ms. Graham said, this is a collaboration between the Wheeler Clinic and the West Indian Social Club of Hartford. And tonight's topic is youth eating disorder and nutrition awareness. And I'm really honored to introduce actually to us a dynamic speaker, Melissa Mendez, LCSW. She's a licensed clinical social worker and director of early childhood programs at Wheeler Clinic in Plainville, Connecticut. She's also a part-time professor at Southern Connecticut State University, Department of Social Work in the MSW program. Melissa attained her BA in English Literature and Foreign Language from West Virginia University and an MSW MS in Social Work and Child Development from the University of Michigan. Melissa has formal training in child parent psychotherapy, CPP, and has been working with children and families for over 20 years to support families in the areas of child development, child health, and behavioral health and family relationships. Welcome, Ms. Mendez.
Thank you so much. I hope that you can hear me.
You can.
Yes, okay. Okay, good. A little bit of technical difficulties to get started, but I think we're in good shape now. I'm excited to be here and be part of this series. I looked at the list of topics and I see that it's very diverse, and that's great. When I was asked to speak on this topic, I was a little hesitant because it's not an area of expertise for me. My area that I've been really focused on for my whole career has been very young children, and especially very young children who've been impacted by trauma. However, for the past 5 years, I've been teaching in the MSW program at Southern Connecticut State University. And one of the courses I teach is practice with families. And oftentimes my students and some of the programming that we do, or we discuss in courses, it revolves around eating disordered behavior. And some of it eating disordered behavior that is at a diagnosed level, and some of it that is just kind of lying on the surface of other behaviors that are happening. So what I wanted to do tonight is just pull together some good information for you to share on eating disorders, in a little bit in general, but also a little bit more information that's focused on children and youth. And then a little bit later, we're going to talk more specifically about nutrition and the brain. And that's something that is a very, very much of interest to me. And just for full disclosure, I have 2 teenagers. And so both of my teenagers have been very active in sports. And I'm seeing now that they're older teens, they're 16, almost 17-year-old daughter and an 18-year-old son. This sort of preoccupation and thought with body size and shape is very much a part of their life, even though I don't feel like we have created an environment that has emphasized that. The environment with which they've grown up with friends and social media has created that. And so we try to keep it open in our house and talk about it. And I'm transparent with sort of my experience as a parent, because I think that it's relevant, and I think it's meaningful for us to share our experiences as grown-ups who care for children and teens. So let me just take a second to find my slides that I have for you. And can you see the slide that I have here now?
Yeah, yes, we can. And before you start, I just want to
Sure.
let folks know, like the last time, we have a $25 gift certificate for persons who can answer some of the questions that we're going to ask at the end. So this is a great presentation. Listen closely, but we're going to, at the very end, there's a small prize. So listen to her talking, and obviously look at the slides that she's presenting. And hopefully you'll be the winner at the very end. Thank you, Melissa.
Yeah. Oh, wow. I didn't know that was happening. So, so yeah, that's a good way to get people to pay attention. So as part of preparing myself to do this, I actually went through a training on my own through this organization, the National Eating Disorders Association. I'm sorry. I just want to make sure if I think maybe somebody needs to mute. Is that okay?
I muted them.
Okay, thank you. I went through a training on my own to kind of prepare myself for this. And so it's allowed me now to share some of the content that I learned in this program. This organization, the National Eating Disorders Association, is an incredible resource. There's so much stuff here to share and learn. I could spend all day with you talking about it. But I made sure that I put the content on the slides, and I'll make sure these slides get to folks so that they have them. But it was kind of a good experience for me just to have not just an overview, but to really try to dig deeper into information relating to children and youth, but even more specifically to children and youth of color. The data is really not there, I'll be honest with you. And I tried to find Connecticut specific data on children and youth with eating disorders that looks at demographics, and I really couldn't find anything. And I really looked hard for several weeks. So for me, what I feel is that this is probably something that we need to look into, is to how do we get this data, and how do we know what's happening for our kids if we don't have the information that we need to understand it. One of the things I learned through this training that was really eye-opening for me is that eating disorder as a mental health issue is the disorder that's highest associated with suicide for teenagers. And I didn't realize that. I guess I thought, maybe depression would be the mental health disorder that was more that was more correlation with suicide, but it's actually eating disorders. And so that's something to be really aware of as we think about how we pay attention to this issue and how we protect our kids and our teenagers from those kinds of experiences. So I sort of want to start with, why is it important for us to talk about? Well, over half of teenage girls report and a third of teenage boys report that they actually use unhealthy weight control behaviors. Things like skipping meals, smoking, because they know that it ruins appetites and it causes them to sort of have less of an appetite and also to have a lower metabolism or a higher metabolism. Fasting, certainly vomiting, and even taking laxatives. All of this is reported behavior by over half of teenage girls and a third of teenage boys. So it's not unique for girls. It's happening for boys also. It's happening for boys for a different reason. Usually girls want to be thinner, boys want to be bigger and stronger. That's what the data is telling us. But the bottom line is that we all know kids. If this many kids are engaging in these behaviors, it means we all know kids in our circles who this is impacting in some way, shape, or form, whether they're our own children, our nieces and nephews, our neighbors, our cousins, whatever. We know kids who are engaging in these behaviors. Eating disorders are, again, the highest correlation of any mental health for teens and suicide is eating disorders. It's a real life-threatening illness and has potentially fatal consequences for kids. It involves extreme emotions, attitudes, behaviors that are sometimes obsessive and compulsive as it relates to weight, food, and body shape and size. There's sort of three categories of causes for eating disorders that include biological, physiological, and sociocultural, which we'll talk about. There is a genetic component to eating disorder behavior. We do see correlations of, especially in girls, if you have teenage girls who are engaging in eating disorder behavior, it's more likely that they had a parent who was engaging, usually the mother, in eating disorder behaviors. And again, it impacts, youth, and it also impacts adults. So everyone is affected by eating disorders, all genders, all races. It shows up everywhere. It shows up in different ways, which we'll talk about in just a few minutes. And we have as many as 20 million women and 10 million men who struggle with eating disorders at some point in their life. So it's a very prevalent experience that a lot of people go through. I don't know how you feel about this, but I would argue that with the advent of social media and the presence of social media in not just kids' lives, but everyone's lives, and sort of the presentation of what looks good, what's aesthetically pleasing in terms of body shape and size, this has amplified this issue. And not only that, and I had to learn this from my daughter, is that she said, "Oh, Mom, you can go, there's lots of places where you can go on social media to find out how to lose 10 pounds in 3 days," right? So we have tutorials on how to be eating, how to have eating disordered behavior readily available for kids to just sort of log into and learn from. And that's very concerning and scary, because it's not something that is easily screened or detected if you're a grown-up who cares about a child and you're concerned. Anybody has any questions or wants to comments, you can pop in at any time. A little bit more statistics just to give us a sense of what we're looking at here. About 9% of the whole population, not just kids, or 28.8 million Americans will have an eating disorder in their lifetime. But less than 6% of people with diagnosed eating disorders are actually diagnosed as underweight. So it's a little bit of a stereotype that folks who are like visibly underweight are the people who have the eating disorders. People who look very normal weight or even overweight from like a visual perspective are more likely to be the ones who are suffering with eating disordered behavior. So it's not the case that it's less than 6% of the people with those eating disorders are medically diagnosed as underweight. Again, the genetic heritability of eating disorders is fairly high. It's a large range, 28 to 74%, but it is there. The risk level is there. And you could look at that from a biological perspective or from a sort of from a nurturing perspective, right? If you have an eating disordered a woman who had eating disorder behavior as a teen in the 80s and has a child who's now a teenager, and some of those behaviors or obsessions or compulsions carried over into her parenting, it makes sense that a daughter would have those same behaviors or at least internalize some of those messages. Again, eating disorders are among the deadliest mental illnesses, second only to opioid overdose. So it didn't include substance abuse before, but it's a deadly disease. 10,200 deaths a year are a direct result of an eating disorder. That's one death every 52 minutes, one death every hour on average. And about over a quarter of people that have eating disorders will attempt suicide, some of them successfully. So it's a very concerning and very serious disease and condition that we have to pay attention to, especially as it relates to our kids and youth. I was able to get some eating disorder statistics on our Black, Indigenous, people of color population. They're significantly less likely than white counterparts to have been asked by a doctor about eating disorder symptoms. No surprise, right? Our kids and grown-ups who are from our marginalized communities, they don't get asked these questions, the same questions as the white counterparts in a doctor visit. And eating disorder is on that list. And so I believe that what that means is that we have to educate our pediatric and primary care community much more about the seriousness of this. And we also have to, as grown-ups, be advocates for our kids, right? And make sure that those questions are being asked. And certainly our Black, Indigenous, people of color with eating disorders are half as likely to be diagnosed or to receive treatment for eating disorder behavior. Every made-for-TV movie or program that I've ever seen about eating disorders in my life has been a white girl. And so it's really, once I saw these statistics, I started thinking about that and thinking, I believe that in our society, we have decided that this is a white teenage girl issue, but it does impact all kids, regardless of color and regardless of gender. More prevalent in girls, no question, but this is important stuff that we need to be aware of. An interesting statistics is that Black people are less likely to be diagnosed with anorexia than white people, but they may experience the condition of anorexia for longer periods of time, probably because they're not getting diagnosed and treated, right? The bullet prior to this. And that Black teenagers are 50% more likely than white teenagers to exhibit bulimic behavior, things like binge eating and purging. So it seems like binge eating and purging is more of a condition that we see among our Black teenager population, and we see anorexia more so in our white teenager population. And then Hispanic teens are 62% more likely to suffer from those bulimic behaviors, things like binge eating and purging, as opposed to anorexia. So when we're thinking about what types of eating disorder behavior are our teenagers who are Black and Hispanic are engaging in, the likelihood that it's more bulimic behavior is higher than if it's anorexic behavior. Anybody have any questions or thoughts about that? Is that something you were aware of?
I have a question for you, Ms.
Sure.
Mendez. So at what age should we be concerned? When does this start?
Yeah, I hope that that's my next slide, because that's like a perfect segue. Yes, this is my next slide. Young is my answer. We need to start thinking about this young, because this data was terrifying for me. As I mentioned before, I'm an early childhood person. So I'm typically in the, third grade and under realm of work with kids. 42% in a research study, 42% of first grade to third grade girls reported wanting to be thinner. First to third graders. 81% of 10-year-olds were, quote, afraid of being fat. And 46% of 9 to 11-year-olds are sometimes or very often on diets. Almost half of 9 to 11-year-olds are engaging in diet behavior. So the answer is young. We need to start thinking about this at a very young age. 35 to 57% of adolescent girls engage in what we call crash dieting. Like I said before, my daughter saying, oh, this is how you lose 10 pounds in 3 days. That's crash dieting. Fasting, certainly self-induced vomiting and diet pills and laxatives that they can get their hands on. And then we've got college campus surveys that tell us 91% of women admit to controlling their weight through dieting. So, this is kind of the, it goes from like youngest to oldest, but a little bit shocking to know that 42% of first to third grade girls are already thinking about wanting to be thinner, and that 81% of 10-year-olds are afraid of being fat. Right? Any reactions to this information? Does it surprise you?
It's surprising, and it's also shocking.
Mm-hmm.
Right? To think that the first grade to third grade,
Mm-hmm.
that many children are concerned about being thin, and they engage in that behavior. That's shocking.
Very shocking. Yeah. And I guess the 46% of 9 to 11-year-olds who are sometimes or very often on diets is equally shocking to me. And I was thinking about, like, when my daughter was 9 to 11-year-old, that's, pre-puberty. If you have children in your life, whether you're a parent or an auntie or a grandparent, I mean, their bodies are changing a lot. And there tends to be, we were just talking about the other night, we were looking at pictures of her, and I was like, there were periods of time where she did get a little chunkier, and then she'd have a growth spurt and she would look really thin. And then she would get a little chunkier again, and then a growth spurt, and I look at those pictures now and I think, wow, like her body changed so fast over that pubescent period. And I think about that age range of 9 to 11-year-old girls who are dieting. Like, how is your body managing those growth spurts if you're experiencing nutrition deficiencies through dieting? So those are all things sort of that come to my mind when I think about these age. Anybody else have any comments or thoughts about it?
There is a question, actually. It's kind of going back. Okay. There is a question, and I'll ask it now because she's asking.
Okay.
And the question is, do you know if suicide attempts are through their eating disorders or by other means?
I don't know the answer to that, but my best guess is maybe a little bit of both.
Okay.
I think there's probably attempts with means other than sort of starvation, basically. But I don't know the answer to that. But it would be interesting to know that data a little bit more in a little bit more detail. This was interesting too, as we get to the idea of at what age we need to start paying attention. 40% of girls and women age 15 to 24. 15 to 24 is the age group that's most likely to be actively engaging in eating disorder behavior. 15 to 24-year-old women. 40% of them who presented with eating disorder behavior report that their behavior started between the ages of 9 to 12 years old. And so again, it links back up to the other number, the 46% of 9 to 11-year-olds who are saying they're sometimes on a diet or almost always on a diet. So 9 to 12, is a really important spot to pay attention to this, especially for girls. From my experience being a parent, I believe that I don't have data on boys on this, but from my experience of being a parent, I tend to believe that it might come a little bit later, like maybe between the ages of 14 and 15, or even 13 and 15, just because of the way I saw my son's sort of evolution through very skinny, lanky kid to wanting to be more big and muscular, right? And being almost a little bit too focused on lifting weights. But this is important for us to know because we know that that 9 to 12-year-old range for girls is a very important spot to pay attention to as it relates to the kinds of messages we send girls about their bodies and the kinds of like food experiences that they have. And we'll talk about that towards the end. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide because I'll give it to you. And I just realized, wow, it's already 7:30. I'll give it to you to have, but this just really kind of breaks down the 3 categories of causes behind eating disorder. I mean, like a lot of mental health disorders, there's so many factors that play, right? There's this family history of, there's genetic predispositions, there's the psychological elements of it, you know, the self-esteem issues, the feelings of inadequacy, the feelings of anxiety. And then there's certainly this whole socio-cultural environment that our kids are living in that really overvalues thinness and body appearance to a large extent. And sort of, we have a whole culture of shows and products and everything that is meant to make us feel bad about the size of our bodies. And so it's hard for grown-ups to manage the onslaught of those messages. Imagine what this is like for kids and teenagers, right? And so we have to know that it's like all 3 of these categories happening simultaneously. I think about it like the inside of a clock, right? If you go up in a clock tower and you look in the inside of it, and all these things are working in different ways, but they're all working together. We have to think about these factors as all intermingling. They're different, but they're all contributing to possibly the same outcome. So some things about eating disorders that are typical, you know, sort of myth thinking. So what I learned about this was really important is that there are a lot of truths about eating disorders that we need to know. Many people with eating disorders look very healthy. They look great, and we tell them they look great, and that sometimes perpetuates the eating disordered behavior because they need to stay looking great according to what other people are telling them. We want to make sure we're not blaming families, and can be then families can be the patients and even the providers' best allies in treatment. I always tell families that I work with or individuals that I work with that we always have to believe that parents want what's best for their kids. And because if we're not believing that, then we're not going to get anywhere. You have to be on the same page with the family if you want to help the child. Eating disorders diagnosis is a health crisis that does disrupt personal and family functioning. It causes a lot of tension in families. Sometimes you have family members who are taking it very seriously, and sometimes others are just saying, it's not a problem. You're making it out to be too much, right? They don't take it seriously. But we have to see it as, you know, a serious health crisis if it's happening in a family. Eating disordered behavior is not a choice. It's a serious biologically influenced illness. So it's not like something a teenager can just stop, or even a grown-up can just stop. Eating disorders affect, I mentioned this before, across all genders, ages, races, body shapes and weights, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status. It's everywhere. It's not discriminate. And eating disorders carry an increased risk for suicide and medical complications. We talked about that. Genes and environment play an important role in the development of. Genes alone do not predict who will develop eating disorders, though. And full recovery from eating disorders possible. Early detection and intervention is important, and so is prevention. If we think about those earlier years, prevention is so key. So some common warning signs are here, things that you probably would sort of think stereotypically would be warning signs: weight loss, dieting, control of food, a real preoccupation with controlling food is a pretty good warning sign, and food rituals. So, sort of doing things in a ritualistic way as it relates to food could be a good warning sign. I've seen where I've seen kids with eating disorder cut their food up in really tiny bites because they want to show that they're taking a lot of bites, but they don't want to eat a lot. And so really kind of paying attention to those kinds of small behaviors. Certainly social withdrawal, not wanting to eat with other people is a huge red flag. Frequent dieting, checking the body, obsessively talking about the body, and then mood swings. Related to sometimes nutrition deficiencies, which we'll talk about at the end of this. If you're seeing noticeable weight fluctuations, or you know that a child or a teenager is having gastrointestinal issues, certainly dizziness, fainting a lot is a sign that this is a person who's probably not getting enough calories in. Difficulty concentrating, unusual or disrupted sleep, which is common for a lot of teenagers, to be honest with you. But if it's coming with all of these other things, it would be important to pay attention to. And then issues with like teeth, skin, hair, nails, bad breath can sometimes be a sign of significant nutritional deficiency. If a child or teenager is not eating well, that can have an impact. Things like hair thinning, falling out, skin being very dry, not as like supple looking, having more like cavities because teeth may be deteriorating due to lack of nutritional deficiencies. These are things to look at. Certainly obsessions about appearance. Female youth typically, as I said before, want to be thinner, typically, and male youth typically want to be bigger and more muscular. That's pretty much how this goes. Even if female youth want to be thinner in certain areas of their body and not thinner in other areas of their body, that can also lead to this eating disordered behavior. So my question for you, just take a minute, how does social media make this more prominent for young people? We've touched on it, but I'm interested to hear what your thoughts are.
Well, I think one example that you gave is that your daughter suggested that she can get a cure for overweight or whatever the issue is with body image on social media. So the easy access.
Easy
kids,
access.
yeah, kids have their phone. Every kid probably within like maybe 9. I don't know how young now my kids are grown, but maybe 8, 7, 6 to 10, 12. They have their own cell phones, so they have access to that and computer. And also the ads on TV, on YouTube or whatever medium they're looking at. These models are skinny or they're muscular or their body look like they're into, the male look like they're into heavy sports, and that would suggest that they're not eating too much, but they're exercising a lot. And the females are skinny, that means they're controlling their weight. So I think that would impact those kids.
Yeah, the sort of a distorted reality of what bodies look like too, because I think everything that we see on social media is photoshopped basically. If it's coming from celebrities or anybody who's influencing on social media, they're using apps to like alter their body size and appearance and their facial features and everything. So, I mean, how do we get kids to understand that that's not reality, you know, because it's causing them to believe that they're not living up to that standard. And that's kind of what's feeding some of this obsession about appearance. Any other thoughts or experiences you've had with this, with kids in your life or personally? Eating disorder, diagnostically, eating disorder comes in these different forms. And so we talked about it before. We have anorexia, bulimia, and binge eating disorders. We have this disorder behavior called avoidant restrictive food intake. And then we have other specified feeding or eating disorders. So sort of there may be a specific eating pattern that someone has that doesn't fit into these other categories. So we would call it other specified. And some are just so complex and unique that they don't necessarily meet diagnostic criteria, but all of them have to be taken seriously. And all of them certainly have different warning signs. I think that, you know, one of the things that I did really find interesting was that the bulimia and binge eating disorder is more prominent in our communities of color for teenage girls. And my family's Mexican American, and I grew up in a household where the food was always being cooked and out to eat. A lot of you grew up the same way. Someone was always cooking something very yummy in the kitchen, and you could eat all day and all night if you wanted to. So it was easy. It would have been easy to engage in bulimic behavior and binge eating in my culture. It wouldn't have been easy to engage in anorexia because all we do is eat all the time. And if you're not eating, somebody's going to know, why aren't you eating? What's wrong with you? You're not eating with us, you know? So I think culturally too, within families, especially, we don't have good filters sometimes with how we ask people about, and I guess in some ways it's actually a good thing that if we notice a family member, especially a teenage girl or boy who's not eating with the rest of the family, we're all up in that business, right? We want to know why aren't you eating? Especially, you know, a lot of times your mother, your aunties are all over your case if you're not eating. But I think that for me, learning that this bulimia and binge eating disorder is something that is probably easier to hide in cultures where food is something that's very much prominent and part of our lives, whereas anorexia would be difficult to hide in communities if you're a teenage girl and you live in a family that is Mexican American or Dominican or whatever, you know. I thought that was interesting. I'm going to sort of go through, we could go through each of these just quickly, just looking at anorexia, characterized primarily by self-starvation. That's what it is. It's not eating to attain excessive weight loss. You're looking at inadequate food intake, caloric intake that is incredibly too low, especially for children and youth a lot of times. And it's paired oftentimes with what we call body dysmorphia, like this, like disdain for how you look, how your body looks, fear of weight gain, obsession with weight gain and not gaining weight, persistent behavior to prevent weight gain, anything to keep from putting on weight. And also a big, heavy dose of denial. The inability to see that there's a problem is very consistent with anorexia. A lot of girls with anorexia are almost like hysterical that they're being sort of questioned about their behaviors because they have no ability to understand the severity of it. Bulimia is characterized by binge eating, so eating a lot at one time, and compensatory behaviors such as self-induced vomiting, attempt to undo the effects of binge eating. This could be using laxatives as well, which I know when I was a teenager, in the 90s, early 90s, I can remember girls I knew in high school who were abusing laxatives to maintain their weight or to lose weight. It's a lot of fear of loss of control during binge eating, a lot of, can't control it, can't stop it. And, most people who binge eat are of a normal weight because they balance it, right? They binge eat and then they do these elimination strategies. So they look like normal weight, but the impact that has on the body is significant. Characterized binge eating, again, is characterized by recurrent binge eating without the regular use of compensatory measures to counter the binge eating. So, for example, the binge eating out of control and you're eating to the point of discomfort. And oftentimes people who have binge eating disorder are pretty obese. So they're not necessarily engaging in the purging behavior. They're only doing the binging. And so that can be certainly something that happens for kids and youth also. Sometimes even as young as I've had 4 and 5 year olds who were very obese, 4 and 5 year olds who do food hoarding in their rooms or wherever they can hide food, and they binge eat. And both times I've dealt with this with early childhood, it's been a situation where there are children who are in foster care who had very traumatic early life experiences that involved not having access to food. And so even at a very, very young age, 2s and 3s and 4s, this behavior can start to manifest as a result of the experience that these kids have. Avoidant restrictive food intake, characterized by lack of interest in food, fears of negative consequence of eating, and selective or picky eating. Very picky eaters, food restrictive. They're reducing their food intake and have a lot of complaints of comfort, no apparent causes, and a lack of appetite or interest in food. I wouldn't call them avoidant restrictive. There's only probably 12 things that my son likes to eat. We can get him to try other things, and he's 18. We can get him to try other things, but his go-to is probably about 12 things. And I was so happy because when we went on vacation, on vacation to Mexico, to the Yucatan, right before the pandemic started. He loves fish, and which is great because that's a nutrient dense food. So of all the things that he likes, I'm happy that that's one of them. He ate fish tacos literally for every meal. So we knew wherever we were going to go to eat, we had to make sure that fish tacos were on the menu. And as a family, we've just figured out, okay, yes, he has this avoidant restrictive tendency, but we're trying to manage it as a family to make sure that he's getting his nutrients and that he's not walking around, because of all the people in our family, he's the one who cares less about food. He doesn't have an interest in eating. If we miss a meal, if we don't eat within 2 or 3 hours, we're like, when are we eating? And he could go all day without even thinking about food. And sometimes people they just function that way. I don't understand it, but it's how some people just function. And then we've got these other specified feeding or eating disorders that we could think about, and again, you'll have the slides to talk about them to get that information on them. The co-occurring disorders with eating disorders are oftentimes things like mood disorder, anxiety, and even substance use. So oftentimes you may have a child or a teenager presenting with mood disorders or anxiety or substance use, and eating disorder is part of that. And so you have these co-occurring disorders happening together, and that requires sort of co-occurring treatment, in terms of how we not necessarily pull them apart, but how do we treat both of these things that are happening simultaneously and probably feeding each other. The health consequences are pretty significant for eating disorders. I probably don't have to tell you that. Cardiovascular, muscle loss, low or irregular heartbeat. Usually when we have a story about football player, dropped after the game and had a heart attack and died on the field. I don't want to say all the time, but oftentimes it has to do with the fact that the way that that particular individual has created maybe some eating disordered patterns has had an impact on their cardiovascular system. Gastrointestinal issues, bloating, nausea, constipation. For girls, we'll talk about the neurological piece in another set of slides, but for girls, oftentimes when they're experiencing eating disorder behavior, their menstrual cycle stops and they won't have it. And I actually know a few grown-up women who experienced eating disorders significantly as teenagers who really never got it back. Even after they got to a healthy weight, they couldn't get that function to start again, which resulted in fertility problems, So the endocrine system is impacted significantly by this too. And it's certainly a serious, potentially fatal illness. I want to push through to, there's treatment information here, but what I really wanted to get to was a couple of slides at the end here. When we think about how to help, if we know this is going on for children and youth, whether they're in our families or our friends, it's good to know about eating disorders, to learn as much as you can and be honest about what you know and share it. Be caring, but also be direct. And because a lot of times, not only the child or youth might deny that there's a problem, but their parents might also deny that there's a problem just because it's so overwhelming to think about as a parent. You can make suggestions about getting help, and you can be a good role model. We certainly don't want to place shame, blame, or guilt. We don't want to be alarmists. We don't want to scare people, say, oh, this could happen and that could happen, right? We don't want to make rules or promises that we can't uphold. If we have children in our lives that are experiencing eating disordered behavior, we don't want to set them up for failure. We want to work with simple solutions. We don't want to invalidate their experience or try to convince them of something. We don't want to give advice about weight, exercise, or appearance, certainly. We don't want to ignore or avoid the situation. The more practical things, though, are what I wanted to kind of get to, and that is that we don't want to power struggle. If we think about going back to younger age kids, we don't want to power struggle over food and meals, right? We want to allow children and adolescents to make choices about what they eat. Don't restrict food from children and youth unless you're doing it under the advice of a pediatrician or an APRN. Just talking to my sister-in-law, she's got a 7-year-old girl and a 5-year-old girl and a 1-year-old baby boy. And she's saying that she wants to limit their sugar intake, right? And I said, that's great. Limit their sugar intake, but do it by not bringing it in the house, right? If you want to limit sugary foods and drinks, do it by not bringing it in the house. Don't set those kids up for failure by bringing it in the house and then making it off limits to them. And this can be a setup for binge eaters too, right? If you have this stuff in your house and you may have a child or a teenager who's a binge eater, you're setting the stage for them to engage in that behavior. And we certainly don't want to shame children and youth about body shape and size, no matter the context, whether we're doing it in a loving way or a joking way, and family members would say, oh, I'm just joking with him, or her about it. But we don't want to do that to kids. These negative messages about the body will be internalized some way, somehow, by that child, by that teenager, and they will have significant meaning for their thinking and their behavior patterns as it relates to their eating, their exercise, and their body image. A couple of other pieces here is that we want to avoid praising children and teenagers about how they look, right? We are such a culture that if we see a girl and she looks really nice, we say, oh my gosh, you look so pretty, or you fit into that dress so perfectly. We just had prom for my 16-year-old, and the comments were really making me crazy because she did look beautiful in her dress, but it was beyond, like the comments were all about her figure and how thin she is and how beautiful it is. And it was just really overwhelming for me. I can imagine for her, she just didn't know what to think of it. We should have positive regard that's unconditional for kids and not dependent on if that child or teenager is thin or in quote good shape. This is especially true for teenagers. So the positive regard should always be there and should always be unconditional, regardless of their shape and size. When we're praising kids for being thin, they're going to internalize that message. We also need to be brave enough to talk to family members who are sending those conditional messages about body shape and size to kids and teenagers in our families. Yeah, they're hard discussions to have, but our children really need for us to protect them from those messages that can be harmful to their mental and their physical health in this case. And so that's something that I just wanted to share with you. I have another, I'm gonna take just like 3 more minutes to run through another set with you. Is that okay, Dr. Rule?
I'll speak for him. It's okay.
Okay, let me stop this and then let me pull up my other set that I have here. Just a second. Real quickly, this is just some information on nutrition and the brain. I just want to share with you real quick before we log out. Okay, share. There you are. Okay. Okay, can you see a pink slide now?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, okay, nutrition in the brain. Sorry, this is really pink. It's like an Easter egg. I didn't realize it was this pink. But even if we take a step back from eating disorder and think about teenagers and kids, right? And nutrition, there's a lot of kids and teenagers who don't meet the criteria for eating disorder, but they're still experiencing what we call nutrition deficiency. And it is still a trigger for mental health disorders, nutrition deficiency. Even if it doesn't meet the criteria of eating disorder behavior, it can still be problematic. So we know the risks, we know the data and the signs of eating disorder, but we also have to recognize that when children and teens are experiencing these deficiencies with their nutrition, that can impact their social and emotional health. What are kids and teens eating, right? This is what kids and teens are eating. If we be honest with ourselves, this is what they're eating. They're eating pizza, they're eating French fries and hamburgers and greasy food, and they're eating potato chips and cheesy puffs and cookies and sugar. I know I have teenagers, not just my kids, but their friends in the house all the time. There's always somebody ordering a pizza around here. And when I say, well, you guys are hungry, what would you like to eat? The answer is always, let's order a pizza or let's go to Popeyes, right? And get the chicken. And so the quality of the food they're eating, we know is not good. It's not stellar. And why? I'm not trying to shame grown-ups, but life is busy, right? Healthy food can be very expensive. Convenience is so convenient when we're working and we're busy. Grown-ups are tired. And for me, nobody ever tells me what they want to eat. They just say, I don't know. So my answer then at the end of a long day when I'm tired sometimes is, okay, well then you're on your own. You figure out what you want to eat, because I'm willing to cook something if people will give me guidance, but nobody is. So enjoy yourself. I'll eat apples and peanut butter. And then they end up eating this stuff. So I will admit, as a grown-up, I could do better at this, right? We all could. Nutrition plays a huge factor in our brain's ability to regulate emotions. And here's how. Healthy foods give us amino acids. You've all heard of that before, right? Amino acids convert in the brain to neurotransmitters. There are 6 neurotransmitters in the brain that play a role in everything that we do. Our muscle contraction, our heart rate, digestion, memory, learning, and mood regulation. Those 3 things are key. Regulation of sleep, eating, moderation of mood, movement, pleasure, and pain. Those neurotransmitters are doing the work of that, and they are built through these amino acids. A lack of proper amino acids in the body impact these neurotransmitters in very meaningful ways and can cause disorders in all of those functions that I just mentioned. So an example is that serotonin, which I know you've heard of, is an important neurotransmitter in the brain that's known as, quote, a feel-good hormone that helps regulate mood. And low levels of serotonin have been linked to suicide. So when we're eating foods that aren't giving us those amino acids that build the serotonin, then we have depleted levels of serotonin that aren't giving us what we need in order to regulate our mood. Some foods that help increase and balance serotonin, just to give you an example, and you could look this up for any of the neurotransmitters to look at what foods are impactful. I just used serotonin as an example. Butternut squash, which good luck if you've got a teenager who will eat butternut squash. That's awesome. I would have trouble with that. Soy, sometimes I can get my kids to eat that. Certainly cucumbers, my kids like. Potatoes, let them eat the French fries, even if it's in the form of a French fry. Nuts and seeds, leafy greens, fish, eggs, and thankfully pineapple is on this list, right? Because I love pineapple. So you can actually do some research and find out what are the nutrient dense foods that my kid might actually like. And I mean younger children as well as teenagers, that I can get in there to try to help them. Because if you're giving them the foods that are supporting those amino acids, the amino acids supporting those neurotransmitters, then you're supporting mood regulation, you're supporting their emotional regulation, all of those things that they need to have healthy social emotional experiences. So as grown-ups, sometimes we try to sneak in these nutrient-dense foods into our children's diets as much as we can. We don't really want to expect them to eat a restrictive diet with just these foods. That's not a possibility. But I just wanted to give you that little bit of information about nutrients and thinking about nutrient deficiencies as it relates to mental health, because we really want to look at it as a holistic approach, right, to children and teenagers' mental health and overall wellness. So take some time and do some research on those neurotransmitters, things like dopamine. What kinds of foods can we, sort of sneak into our kids' lives, or kids that we know their lives, so that they're getting more amino acids into those neurotransmitters for a healthier overall brain wellness. All right, I think I'm all set. Any questions or comments? I know it's a little bit, I think we're a couple of minutes over, but I'm happy to stay and discuss.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Mendez. This was fantastic. It was a really rich session with lots and lots of information. Let's see if there were any questions. There was a question in the chat. I'll kind of go backwards. Can you address the highs and lows of caffeinated energy drinks?
What I know about caffeinated energy drinks is that they really alter the cardiovascular system. They speed up the heart rate in ways that can be very dangerous. So I would not recommend them for teenagers, just because the way that the body is growing during that time, you never know kind of what the cardiovascular system is going to look like during that time period of rapid growth. I can't speak to any kind of specific information on it, but I do know the impact on heart rate is concerning. And that if you have, so let's say you have kids who are engaging in caffeinated energy drinks, and then they're going to the gym and they're jumping on a treadmill, then you've got like a double dose of increased heart rate. That's dangerous for anybody. So I'd be very careful about that and make sure that you're talking to teenagers about that and understanding it. Does that make sense?
It does. Another question, well, comment and question. It seems that individuals on medication for mental illnesses pack on weight. Then on top of those mental issues, they have to deal with body issues. That was really more common. What do you think about that statement?
Yeah, well, I think that's it speaks to that co-occurring disordered sort of reality, is that most people who do have any kind of mood anxiety disorders and are getting medication for that, the result is weight gain. In fact, I've worked with a lot of young mothers in early childhood who have really needed to be on medication to stabilize their mood and to sort of get regulated, but who won't do it because they are afraid it's going to help make them gain weight. So there's also sort of a thinking that, manage my weight by not taking my medication, so they're definitely correlated and connected. I think that what you have to have happen when you're experiencing that is that you have to have a really good treatment, really good provider who knows how to treat both of these things at the same time. Right. And so it's going to be really a matter of finding the right service provider or the right program that understands these things are integrated and they need to be treated in an integrated way.
Thank you for that answer response. We are at the top of the hour, so I think we will close. I don't see, there was another question in the chat, but I think you answered it.
I have a question, Dr. Rowe.
Go ahead.
Melissa, you mentioned that eating disorder starts real early in kids and that the marginalized community, people of color, are oftentimes ignored to get a diagnosis. Are we seeing any growth or behavioral issues in that demographic that was probably misdiagnosed?
That may have been, that in hindsight may have been more eating disordered behavior rather than attention deficit disorder or conduct disorder, things like that.
Right.
I don't know if there's data on that, but the data that tells us that the disparity in how our children and teens of color are getting diagnosed with eating disorders, like common sense tells me that yes, we're missing it and we're misdiagnosing these kids. It's the same story as when we, for a long time, pediatricians would diagnose 3-year-old boys, 3-year-old Black toddler boys presenting with behavior problems at the pediatrician were getting diagnosed with conduct disorder at the age of 3, when in fact they had ear infections and they couldn't hear and they were struggling with behaviors because they can't hear and their speech wasn't up to par because they can't hear. And so we misdiagnosed them with conduct disorder when really what they needed were tubes in their ears. And so it's not dissimilar to that, I'm sure. I didn't find any data on that, Claudette, but it's definitely something that we need to keep our eyes and ears open and talk to pediatricians and talk to our communities about more.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question? You open a can of worms, I guess, because I think with a question that Claudette asked, right? So if there's this gap in information specific to Black, Hispanic, people of color, and that's not happening, what policy changes need to occur to be sure that that actually happens? Because we're saying that's happening today. We don't want to have the same conversation 5 years from now, where there's no information on this specific demographic. So what do we need to do to make that change?
Well, I'm sighing because this has been a week of how are we going to change the world for these kids? Like on all levels, you know what I mean? Like this is everything happening this week, in the past several weeks, actually. I think that we have to be vocal about the data. We have to say, hey, this data is a little alarming. Can someone pay attention to this? there have been some groups that have looked at racial and ethnic disparities in a couple of different ways, some more education, some more health. I know Child Health and Development Institute of Connecticut is sort of the premier place to go to look at this. But I think that once people know that the data is a little bit alarming, then there's a little bit more of an effort to let's look closer and see if we can get even more data. And as I mentioned to you before, I had a really hard time finding data, and I'm pretty good at research here in Connecticut. I found stuff that I never thought I'd find. I really had a hard time finding data on this particular issue as it relates to children of color, children and teenagers of color. And even nationally, it's not really laid out very well. And so I do think that the more that we can advocate for it in our places, our organizations, that's important. But it's a good question. I'll have to think about it. Yeah, Monique is right. We are not represented in the research.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to let you go. There's one other question, comment in the chat before we go to the giveaway. Right? If you listen to the question, let's see. It is a comment first. It looks like it is challenging to consider the risks and benefits of treatment. Medications for ADHD have a side effect of decreased appetite and weight loss, which can contribute to eating disorders. It sounds more like a comment, right? So a side effect of first-line medications to treat depression and anxiety in adolescents have a side effect of weight gain, but one stable treatment can be paired with exercise or physical activity. So I guess it's more of a comment.
Yeah, and all of that I think is 100% on point. And I think that, you know, if you have a teenager, or even a young adult, or even a grown adult, you know, experiencing loss of appetite due to some kind of psychotropic medication that they're having to use in order to manage other things, you know, we have to pay attention and we have to support, you know, and provide as much as we can and make sure that we're doing it in a warm and unconditional way. This topic tends to, especially with teenagers, but especially with even adults, as I mentioned before, people tend to think that this is a choice, that this is behavior that's a choice behavior, and it's not. You know, we looked at those three categories and we know that it's much more complicated than that, than just turning off the switch.
All right, thank you. We're at time. I'm going to describe how we're going to do the giveaway. You presented so much rich information, and I kind of scribbled notes. I'm going to ask one. For you to be the winner, what we're going to ask you do is the first person who puts the right answer in the chat wins the prize. And it's a $25 gift card. So this question I have is, it's a number. The answer is a number. So what, and it's about underweight, right? So what percentage of persons who are underweight and have eating disorder, all right, and let me rephrase it. What percentage of persons who have eating disorder are underweight? That's really the question. Mm-hmm. So they have eating disorder and they're underweight. What percentage of persons have that description? And I'll give you some ideas. 90%, 50%. Oh, we got an answer. It looks like, okay, we have 634 in the chat. The first person with that answer was Nadine. Yeah, 6%. Nadine, you are the winner.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Nice note taking, Nadine.
Very, very, very good. This was really, really, really good. I hope you guys enjoyed it. We'll get Nadine her gift card. Thank you, Melissa. Thank you, Wheeler Clinic. Thank you, the West Indian Social Club. I'll turn back over to Miss Graham.
Well, can I just say one more thing though, Dr.
Sure.
Rule, real quickly, is that if anybody is interested in this issue of let's find more data, let's find out what's going on with our kids and our teens who are in our communities, I'm open to that. So we can touch base on that at a later time if we want to brainstorm some ideas about that.
Okay, thank you,
Thank
Ms. Melissa. Your presentation was very informative. It was eye-opening, and it's going to cause us to change our mindset and our behavior, and probably even watch our kids even closer to the. I'm sure they
Yeah.
won't like that, but very informative. I wondered about a topic and what you would present, but it was very engaging, and I just want to thank you for taking the time to do it and do it so well. Dr. Rule,
Thank
thank
you.
you. You're welcome. Dr. Rule, thank you for moderating, and you're the on-point person for the rest of the series, and thank you for that commitment. I just want to also thank our the newest person on our team is Chev Dodd. She's the new person who's a project coordinator. She's handling the Zoom, and she's putting out the information about this collaboration, and she's doing a great job. Chev, thank you and welcome. And so the next topic will be anxiety and depression, and it will be held on Thursday, June 23rd at 7 p.m. Please join us. Ms. Keller, I will send you, I'll get you, you're my sister, so I know how to get you the gift card. So I'll get you the gift card. And thank you for participating. Thank you everyone for coming out. You made a big difference in just engaging and participating, and have a good night.
Night.
Good night, guys.
Good night.
Take care. Thanks.